Well, the virus has now killed more than 100 people in China, and new cases have been confirmed around the world.
So you don't want to frighten the American public.
France and South Korea have also got evacuation plans.
But you need to prepare for and assume
strongly warning Americans to avoid all non-essential travel to China.
That this is going to be a real serious problem.
France, Australia, Canada, the US, Singapore, Cambodia, Vietnam, the list goes on.
Health officials are investigating more than 100 possible cases in the US.
Germany, a man has contracted the virus.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
Japan, where a bus driver contracted the virus.
Coronavirus has killed more than 100 people there and infected more than 4,500.
We have to prepare for the worst, always, because if you don't and the worst happens.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to War Room Pandemic, live from Capitol Hill in the nation's capital, Tuesday, the 14th of April, the year of our Lord 2020, episode 117. Now with over 5.8 million downloads, and we're ubiquitous on the John Fredericks Radio Network, on America's Voice channel, Dish Channel 219. They will be showing the entire press conference today, start to finish, and with a pregame show. Also Newsmax TV, FM 99.1, 103.9 in Chicago, Nexus.org and IRRS throughout the world to 250 million English-speaking people from Latin America to the Middle East to Africa. In G News and GTV in Mandarin, subtitled in Mandarin, later in the day as we blow through the firewall to make sure that all the old 100 names can hear this broadcast and know what's going on about the CCP. We're very honored now to be joined by, I think, the most well-sourced reporter about all things China among the national security apparatus, and also deeply sourced inside of China. It's a blockbuster story today in the Washington Post about cables from the State Department that question actually how professionally run the P4 lab in Wuhan was. Our guest is Josh Rogin. Josh, thank you very much for joining us today on War Room Pandemic.
Great to be with you, Steve.
Josh, this has been with Senator Cotton and Senator Hawley and Rubio, and you've had other reporters. This has been one of the most controversial things. People have said, hey, this is a conspiracy theory. These guys are all wingnuts. And we now know about the human-to-human transmission, the CCP hiding that. But your reporting has really, I think, blown the lid off of something that the responsible medical professionals, the responsible public health professionals in the State Department, and people have to understand that Dr. Birx came from the State Department, that these top professionals that really are at the cutting edge of understanding what pandemics are and this research is, and really the hunt for vaccines and therapeutics, that for over the last couple of years have been warning about the professional, not that there's a bioweapons program going on, but just the professional way that this P4 lab is being run in Wuhan. Can you walk us through your story and the sourcing of it?
Sure. So the origin story about the novel coronavirus that we're all suffering from right now is crucial, not just because it's going to help us fight the current pandemic that we're in, but because it's critical information that we're going to need to prevent the next pandemic in the future, right? And as you noted, the whole discussion of this sort of has gotten crazy out of context based on comments that early on that it might have been a bioweapon, et cetera. That's not what this is about. Right. This is about the labs in Wuhan that just happened to be studying bat coronaviruses for years and just happened to be near the outbreak of the virus. And the fact that State Department officials, health officials, science officials, years ago were visiting these labs, looking around, talking to the scientists, and what they reported back were their dire and grave concerns that this one lab, the one super allegedly secure lab in Wuhan, had terrible safety procedures. They didn't have enough personnel. They were doing risky experiments with bat coronaviruses. And they wrote back these two cables to the Washington, which were described to me as warning shots, right? They were sounding the alarm. They were telling people in Washington, hey, this lab here in Wuhan is doing crazy important but also crazy dangerous work on SARS-like viruses coming from bats that could be transmitted to humans. We should take a look at this, and if the lab's not doing well, we should try to help them fix it. Now, what you have to understand is that it doesn't speak to the fact that the that the virus we're dealing with was engineered or anything like that. Actually, it kind of runs against that because this lab was producing public research. If you were developing a secret bioweapon, the last thing that you would do is publish a bunch of public research about it. But it does speak to where the virus emanated from. And when you put that together with all the other information that has come out over the last 2 months, mainly about how the Chinese government the original story about the Wuhan seafood market doesn't hold up to scrutiny for several important reasons that we can get into. And then you add on top of that the Chinese government's severe clampdown on any information related to the virus origins and their disappearing of science and journalists. What you get is a circumstantial case that this actually escaped from the lab as an accident and didn't come from the market at all. And that's what these cables are warning against. 2 years ago, they said, this could happen. We're warning about this. And now that it's happened, people are looking at these cables, especially inside the administration, especially inside the intelligence community, and taking a look at this and being like, oh, my God, we can't discount this. We don't know where the virus came from, but we can't discount that it came out of the lab. And here's a little bit more evidence to support that theory.
Before we go to about how the CCP tried to get the direction to the wet market, just on these itself, when this lab was built, it was very controversial at the time, and people understood that the argument was you wanted to have something essentially forward deployed in the heart of where SARS viruses came from to work on potential therapeutics and vaccines. The French built this, and it was very controversial. There was agreement. When these came out, there's supposed to be an apparatus throughout the World Health Organization, also this other continuum of P4 labs. Now, you mentioned our lab in Galveston, Texas, with the University of Texas. But what happened? Did the World Health Organization, did the apparatus kind of come together and say, hey, we built this and we allowed the Chinese to have this under the supposition they were going to be run as sophisticated and properly as in the United States and England and France? So tell us what happened.
Right, yeah. You're exactly right that, following SARS outbreak, the Chinese wanted to build a state-of-the-art, highest-level biosecurity lab to examine SARS coronaviruses. That's exactly what they did. Not only the French helped them, they were working with the NIH, the Galveston Group, the National Academy of Sciences. There are a lot of scientists, and we're just having a lot of collaboration all over the world all the time. And, that's generally seen as benign because these scientists are like, oh, it's just open science. What could be bad about that? The problem started when this lab under this particular researcher named Madame Shi Zhongli, she started playing around with these bat coronaviruses in a way that made people nervous. And she started publishing research about how she had put them into rats. And now all of a sudden they concluded that perhaps they could get them, it's possible that they could transmit to humans. And so for some people at the embassy who were focused on these things, they looked at them and said, oh, my God, we should check this out. Okay, and they checked it out, and they said, oh, my God, we found that this is a real risk, and, if this lab's not managed properly, a new pandemic could emerge. They didn't think it was going to be like this. They thought it would be like another SARS, okay? And I talked to people who were involved in this, and they told me, we thought it would be like a SARS. We didn't think it would be like a worldwide catastrophe, but even a SARS was worth preventing, but nobody really responded. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is sort of like an institutional aversion to like doing things, both inside the U.S. government and around the world. Another one is like, in China, because of the way their system works, right, there's no such thing as bad news. You can't tell them anything that you don't want to hear. And, all of these problems that are through all these Chinese institutions largely don't get reported. And, if the scientists are called down on it, they're at risk. So your friend, the scientist in China, meets with your friend, the scientist in America, and they're like, oh, well, we should probably do something about this, but nobody wants to be that guy who goes to the government like, we got a big problem here. So for a lot of cultural, institutional, organizational reasons, just nobody did anything. We didn't do anything. They didn't do anything. The world didn't do anything, and now we're in the situation that we're in.
Let's go to the wet market. I know you, because you're so well sourced early on, that wet market thing just didn't hold together particularly. It looked like the CCP was driving people to focus on the wet market. Talk to us about where that originated and where do you think that stands now as a plausible explanation of what actually happened?
Yeah, right. So basically what the people inside the administration told me is that, there's two theories, basically, that it came from this wet market or it came from the labs. And on the side of the wet market are a bunch of data points that don't really check out, right? The first one is that they didn't sell bats, right? And the bats that caused the coronavirus come from Yunnan, which is like 1,000 miles away from Wuhan. And that's where most of the SARS things coming out of that region of China. So these bats would have had to fly 1,000 miles or infect an animal that walked 1,000 miles to the market that didn't even sell the bats in the first place. The second thing was when the Chinese government, they totally wiped out the evidence by sterilizing and cleaning the market like 2 days later, which is the opposite of what you were doing if you were trying to prove the theory that it came from the markets, right? You're doing a forensic investigation, and you're going to douse the place in bleach until there's nothing left to find, right? And then, the third thing is that, like, Chinese scientists, before there was this clampdown, now if you're a Chinese scientist, you can't publish anything on the virus origins. You'll get arrested and disappeared right away. But in January, Chinese scientists published a study in The Lancet which said that the first known case was this old guy who didn't live anywhere. He never been to the market. He never knew about the market. So there's no way he could have gotten it from the market. So there's no way it could have originated from the market. And a lot of the original cases didn't come from the market. So piece by piece, this market theory became very, very shaky, right? And then that caused people inside the government to be like, oh, well, what's next to the market? Oh, 1,000 feet down the road is a different lab, not the one that the cable was about, but an even less secure lab. This is the Wuhan CDC lab. It's called CDC, again, because it's modeled after our CDC. We helped them build it, right? There's a bigger, longer-term story here about how we sort of built the Chinese government and the Chinese life sciences industry, right? Because we thought it would be good for them, good for us, good for the world. It didn't turn out that way.
Yeah, no.
Hey, Josh, this is Jason. I want to go right to that point here, just what the U.S., what we've done as far as giving them money. There's a Daily Mail story that popped on, I believe it was Sunday, and the headline is revealed U.S. government gave $3.7 million grant to Wuhan lab at Center of Coronavirus Leak Scrutiny that was performing experiments on bats from the caves where the disease is believed to have originated. And it said that this is actually an NIH grant that gave $3.7 million to this Wuhan lab that obviously you've gone into considerable detail. What has your reporting borne out here? What have you been able to show on the direct connection between U.S. funding and what the Chinese have taken and gone and done with it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I did report that out. I didn't have a face for it in the column, but I'll tell you what I learned. Basically, the way it works is not that the U.S. government provides money to the Wuhan lab. They provide money to U.S. institutions that work with the lab. So that particular $3.7 million grant went to a U.S. institution. I think it was Galveston, but it could have been one of the other ones that was helping these scientists get their stuff together, okay? And what's interesting about that is that the cables say that this kind of cooperation is positive, that we should do more of it. What the officials in the embassy were calling on Washington to do was to help this lab fix its problems because the viruses that they were studying were so dangerous, and if they didn't have good safety, it could cause a pandemic. So it's not as if we were, doing something bad by helping the lab. I mean, you could argue that we should have never helped them build in the first place, but that's neither here nor there. At the point where we're giving help to them to be more safe, that's money well spent to protect ourselves. And what the cables were saying is that we should spend more to make sure that this lab has its stuff together because they don't seem to have their stuff together on their own.
Josh, we got about a minute left. The big thing is the CDC. What Cotton and everybody's arguing for is that, hey, it's incumbent upon the CCP to open up to these scientists, open up the labs, and let the world, let Galveston go in there, let World Health Organization, CDC, and help out and find out exactly what went on so we can do this. What's the current status with the Chinese Communist Party about access of the West to the real information, to the labs, and to the scientists?
Yeah, not only has there been a coordinated and extensive and well-funded propaganda campaign to distract the world's attention from the fact that this is a real possibility, on the science level, the Chinese government has totally clamped down on any information. They haven't even given the U.S. government or U.S. experts samples of the novel coronavirus that they have, that we need, that we want, that we've asked for, okay? And that's a huge problem, okay? And the reason, so basically what Cotton or the scientists that I talked to, the diplomats, they're all calling for something very simple here, which is transparency and honesty. It's not the Chinese Communist Party's strong point, but in this case, it's a matter of life and death for us, okay? And those calls now have to increase because the origin of the virus is still something that's critical to understanding what we're going through and how to stop it from happening again.
Josh Rogan of the Washington Post, we've got up on our sites the most important story of the day and probably one of the most important stories of this entire thing. If you want to find out what's really going on, it's Josh Rogan's column. Josh, thank you so much for joining us. It's been illuminating.
Anytime.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is real reporting. It's well sourced. It's brutal. It's straightforward. It's just facts. He just lays it out, and you gotta embrace this. The West has to embrace this. This is for all humanity, including the people in China. We're going to return in a moment to discuss all of this on War Room Pandemic.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to Fort Defiance. It's the 14th of April, the year of our Lord 2020. It's looking to be a beautiful Tuesday. Finally got through some of the nasty weather. I think more nasty weather's coming up here. A little chilly this morning. Pretty explosive interview with Josh Rogan. He's known for our audience as just meeting Josh or getting to hear his voice for the first time. Go to the site. He is, I think, the most well-sourced among China hands and the China hawks and the people that follow China. He is the most well-sourced reporter anywhere about on the national security apparatus globally and particularly in China.
I used to fight with Rogan all the time during the 2016 campaign. It would piss me off because his stuff was always right. And I would call up and I'd yell at him. I'm like, Josh, you're fake news. You have no idea what you're talking about. And, you know, he was right, but it's still, you know, I was right to browbeat him. You know, for his anonymous sources, but I got to tell you, every time I called him, yelled at him.
He's a great reporter.
He had it right.
Well, that's why these cables are so, I don't know, shocking. I think the American people are just going to understand, look, we did build a lot of this and we financed a lot of this, and France did too. And the point was, hey, they were always going to be at the tip of the spear of this SARS problem, right? Just because of the way, remember, this is all about globalization. It's the concentration and density of population where you still got all this wildlife around, et cetera. It's not just simply simply the wet markets. That's too simplistic a way to think of it. It's the human to human spread off the farms and all these things. They're living in such concentrated areas among wildlife, right? So, but this is just going to get to be a hot issue about actually what, you know, I hate to, and I don't want to go back to my favorite guy, Yoda. But NIH did give the $3.7 million. I think it was through Galveston. I think it's through the lab in Galveston. I believe we'll connect it. There's a lab, a U.S. lab in Galveston, Texas, that's associated with the University of Texas. You know, and they're very tied to, I think, the management are looking at some of these projects related to Wuhan.
After the terrorist attacks of 9/11, there was a massive overhaul within the U.S. security and defense industry, and we went through and streamlined a number of things and redefined Border Patrol and ICE, and went through a number of the immigration items and a whole bunch of anti-terrorism, pro-security measures. I bet after this coronavirus pandemic that there's going to be a review of our overall our science and our NIH and CDC and our healthcare systems and how we do things, and as we're finding out these fragmented systems that have been in place for decades, what we're funding, who we're funding, this all ties together.
Well, managerially, and of course people's heads are going to blow up when I walk through this, but managerially after 9/11, two basic things happened in the apparatus. Number one, all these disparate programs on, you know, Border Patrol, that was put into a new organization called Department of Homeland Security, which people have said today, you know, even after we won, I talked to Rudy. We really wanted Rudy to head that thing up. And, you know, Rudy was saying, hey, that's a department that's very tough to get a handle on because there's so many disparate units in it. But it was pulled out of the rest of the government to give 1 point for Homeland Security. In addition, DNI came out after that about all the different intelligence apparatuses, right? We have, I think, 17 from DIA to every group's got an intelligence apparatus. So both the intelligence apparatus is supposed to go up to DNI, and all the security part, the Homeland Security part, is supposed to go up so there'll be management, not these disparate functions. And here's what you're going to find out here when people start going through it. Dr. Birx is from the State Department. Right, you're going to see that these cables come from the State Department, right? And it's back to the CDC and NIH. The question is going to get to be, do you have to do a thing here? Because clearly, health security is national security. We know that. Look, when I was in the Navy, any person in the military will tell you, when you got to do the chemical, biological, nuclear weapons exercises, which are always a grind, right? The ones that are the hardest, are always the biological weapon stuff. The nuclear weapon stuff is hard, the chemical weapons, but the biological weapon exercises on and on again are incredibly difficult. The reason is that's a big part of national security. And look, the question on this lab, the big debate on this lab, the treaty was signed back in the 70s. The Chinese did not sign it, okay? When Deng Xiaoping came to power and wanted to normalize relationships with the West, they came into the treaty, I think in 84. The biological weapons treaty. As part of that, they had to cough up the fact that they did have a rudimentary biological weapons program at the time. Then later, okay, when they started getting into the World Health Organization, WTO, all of that, and eventually had this lab after the SARS thing, they had to fess up again. And it turned out that, hey, guess what? They still had some sort of biological weapons program, or they were doing research at the end. The most important part of this, of Josh's interview, I think, was to go through about this doctor, and we'll get into more of her later, about the concern of this was supposed to be, remember, the CDC in the United States government helped build the CDC apparatus in China. That P2 lab, and a P2 lab deals with pathogens that are less, but still, they're still very dangerous. They're just not at the P4 level, which is, hey, we can kill the world, right, which you've seen in this pandemic. The P2 was built in association with the CDC, right? The P4 was built in association with the world, the United States, and particularly the French and others. But what got people's attention, and this is what these cables, you have to read this article, and I'd also like to have some other analysis of your great team, Raheem, today, is to do this, is that what has to be done here is that to understand that very early on, professionals said, hey, you've got this Chinese doctor, and she's doing experiments that may be a little outside the normal. And, you know, this could be very dangerous and not tightly supervised. This is why Dr. Thayer, Bill Gertz, and these guys, in calling it a biological Chernobyl, are onto something. And the fact of, remember, you go back and look at Chernobyl, it's the incompetence of the local managers to actually manage the reactor themselves and understand and shutdown procedures and testing procedures, because it came in a surge test. And also the apparatus's first thing is to protect the apparatus, not to worry about the safety and security of people, whether the local people there or the people throughout the world. And that's why this is and if you read these cables today, you understand it's not the wingnuts of Steve Bannon and Bill Gertz and others. These are the pros from Dover were very worried for really good reasons, and we're kind of sending out, hey, we got to get on top of this because this thing is heading in a direction that's not going to end up well.
Well, the other thing is it's kind of common sense that we should be a little bit frightened about studies of these coronaviruses in bats, because the MERS case in Middle Eastern respiratory sickness, that was a bat virus that transferred to a camel. And then we had SARS-1, which is theoretically a bat virus, coronavirus that transferred to a civet cat. This one now, pangolin, direct to a human from the lab, who knows? But we do know, dating back well more than a decade, that there has been transmission of these bat coronaviruses to the local population down there. They test these people locally, and they find sometimes 15-20% of the people have sometimes multiple antibodies to multiple coronaviruses. So you would have thought that they would have been more cautious about this right out of the box. I mean, the studies on the antibodies date back more than a decade in that local community down there. So you really wonder how the whole international community just stood by and watched it happen.
Raheem, I want you and Jason to pile in here, is that the other thing is that there's two events, and I want to connect some dots here for those that are listening in the hedge fund and the media community. Is that we have the ABC story from the National Medical Intelligence Unit of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which the head guys refuted it, but ABC has stood by their reporting. Nobody's backed off of that. So clearly, that leak of this whatever assessment that was done in November, remember, patient zero, we know from Chinese sources, is the 17th of November. This is what Joshua is referring to, not related to the wet market, but a patient zero that came up on a Chinese site, right, is November 17. You have the intelligence, the Grundoons in the intelligence apparatus have somehow, I cry for help. That's why that's out there. It shouldn't be lost on anybody today that, somebody in the State Department got this to Josh Rogan's a great reporter, and they know he's a great reporter, but those cables came from somebody. That's another cry for help. The mainstream media has got to understand they got to stop denigrating this as some wingnut theory. This is the thing itself, okay? the Chinese Communist Party, they knew about the human-to-human transmission of this early on. And we know from the reports done by the Chinese that 95% of all the death and destruction, including and particularly in Wuhan, could have all been avoided if they had just been honest and with themselves. Now you're going to find out even a deeper level of the story that, hey, this may have not just been a guy eating on a bat, right, that ate a pangolin or something like that, that in reality, for many years, they were on the edge and maybe over the edge, and it wasn't properly supervised, of which people warned about in 2006 from this whole debate. We're going to bring this up over the next couple of weeks. In France, there was a huge controversy in France about the French being involved in even the construction of this, right? The United States, this among that community, it was a huge thing because people said, hey, if this thing's not high and tight, right, and I mean really run at the highest levels of what a P4 lab has to be, you can have a pandemic. And now people realize what that means, right? That means, death and destruction throughout the world. That's why it's incumbent upon the mainstream media. Now you're getting sources from the intelligence units and from the State Department and others are sitting there going, you guys are not covering this correctly. So, hey, why don't you read this, right? And see, and this is going to open up a whole nother avenue of this.
So much of this is, also linked to things that we've already experienced now. These big international institutions that are supposed to keep us safe, whether it was the chemical weapons oversight, 2 decades ago, whether it's the World Health Organization today. And just to get to something that you said, Steve, there about the media, the media have been treating this like a conspiracy theory and all that, even when they start to not. Here's Wired's headline from 2 days ago. A right-wing stunt to pin the blame for COVID-19 on the World Health Organization actually contains a useful notion. So what they're saying is the reporting is correct, and the thesis is correct. They just don't want to say that and report it. So it's they might have accidentally cottoned onto something correct in the whole process.
Okay, we're going to take a short commercial break. Hashtag War Room Pandemic. We're going to send Jason Miller's going to go on assignment. So we'll see Jason back tomorrow. Thank you for all your great reporting and breaking news here. We're going to get drilled down. I want to drill down on what's going on in Japan. Also, I want to drill down on the World Health Organization. Remember, the new head of the World Health Organization is going to be Ben Carson. Hasn't happened yet, but it will happen. We're going to be back in a second in the War Room.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to Fort Defiance. We're live on Capitol Hill, War Room Pandemic. By the way, I'm getting blown up on some of my accounts here, Jack, for giving you stink eye when you were coughing during the interview. I noticed Jack only coughs when we have major guests on. I don't know if it's a Freudian thing that he doesn't feel he's getting enough mic time, but the big cough always comes. But I'm getting blown off because I definitely gave you stink eye. Before we go to News of the World, I want to drill down a little bit on this. And here's the thing. This thing cannot be partisan. We got to get beyond the partisanship. And there's no bigger partisan than myself, Raheem, Jason, and, of course, the Cro-Magnon man, Jack Maxey. But it's this can't be this has to be bipartisan. This has to be, as a country, we have to hold the Chinese Communist Party to account because of what they've done to their people and what they've done to the world. And most importantly, what I'm so shocked about is the Tiananmen Square democracy movement, the human rights movement, was one of the basic parts of the Democratic Party for many years. In the weekend special we had, Descent into Hell, Life of the Chinese People under the CCP, we had people talking about LGBT, talking about the democracy movement, talking about many things that the progressives are always at the forefront of human rights. And yet we've heard crickets about the Chinese Communist Party. So it has to be, I hope this reporting, and I hope particularly the mainstream media, take the lead on people like Josh Rogan, who have sterling reputations when it comes to anything related to national security, both in this country and in China. And take this as a lead that there's a lot of, the ABC story and the Washington Post story now from the National Medical Intelligence Unit and also from the State Department cables he's getting, and also obviously well-sourced inside of NIH and other places, lead to more powerful stories. But go back to this thing yesterday. This is who wrote this, and the right media is getting lit up about this?
Yeah, this is a story on Wired.com, which is typically, business tech, that sort of thing. But they do have political correspondence there as well.
Wired's a major publication.
Yeah, Robert Wright being one of them who wrote this article. The headline, "A right-wing stunt to pin the blame for COVID-19 on the World Health Organization," actually contains a useful notion. And Wright's thesis is, and I'll read it to you here, "This is a quote, this is a familiar right-wing move, subject international institutions to scrutiny that, if all goes according to plan, can be used to justify cutting their funding. Then, as the script typically unfolds, global governance fans like me spring to the defense of these institutions. In this case, though, I am partly in sync with the right-wing move. I don't agree with Scott," he's talking about Rick Scott, "that we should do the investigation ASAP into the World Health Organization, and I'm not in favor of cutting WHO funding. I'm also not nearly as sure as Scott that WHO is guilty as charged, but the organization could have performed better in the early stages of the contagion, and there's at least some reason to suspect that people at the WHO knowingly and consequentially misled us."
Wow, that's a bombshell. Knowingly misled us? I mean, on human-to-human transmission? I mean, Robert, come on, that's more than they somehow failed. That is that's an act of commission, not an act of omission.
That's exactly right. And I don't see how you can make the leap from knowingly and consequentially misleading to not having an investigation ASAP and not being in favor of cutting WHO funding if it's found that at the time the world needed it most, the WHO was found wanting.
Remember, this is a bigger story about Geneva, about these UN operations that the Chinese, and you got, I think, Ambassador Bremberg, he was head of Domestic Policy Council. I think he's the guy that's over there now. But the part of being over there is to root out Chinese control of these organizations without paying up. I mean, it's the United States that still puts the bulk of the money up, and we're not sitting there lording it, oh, we got the money so we can control things. However, in this situation, all the money should be cut off, and we're not saying permanently. We're just saying until they install Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Carson's got to be the head of the World Health Organization. He meets every check. You want to check every box. Ben Carson's the guy. You got to get him in there and clean this thing up for the good of the world.
Well, the worst part of this is that the World Health Organization ends up becoming the real danger here, right? Because the world is relying on them to give us decent advice about world health. The fact that they dropped the ball and ran coverage for the Communist Party of China meant that the whole world was left in the dirt for 6 weeks.
What I don't want to lose the thread on is that people focus on the World Health Organization or some of these sidebar things and drop the thing that's the Chinese Communist Party. This is the power of Josh Rogan's piece. It puts it right back to the Chinese Communist Party and their management of this apparatus. The world, essentially, let's be honest, the world trusted them that they were going to manage this at the level of other responsible governments in the world, in the United States and Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, and France, right, and Germany, and they didn't. And this is why these P4 labs are so potentially dangerous. They are mini Chernobyls, right, and you've got to manage it, over and above this, and they clearly didn't, and not just manage it. But to me, the buried lead or the explosion in Josh Rogan's interview with us is to pinpoint the experimentation that was going on. It wasn't just the management of the day-to-day operations where something could leak out. It's that she was so more aggressive than the rest of the world in actually looking at this whole concept of human-to-human transmission, or the animal to the human transmission immediately that would trigger everything else. That's explosive, and that's what the professionals said. Hey, we got a problem here, right? Houston, we have a problem.
And she actually, the ironic thing is she said the very first thing out of her mouth into her own brain, and she's quoted as saying this, that when she heard about the cases at the Wuhan Central Hospital and she was called over because they wanted her to look at the blood work, the first thing in her brain was, oh my God, did it come from our lab? Now she follows up about 3 weeks later and she said, oh, I went through all 600 viruses that we had. It's not one of our viruses, I swear on my life.
And when she said that, it wasn't to the Daily Caller or Breitbart or to the Washington Examiner. She said that was Science Magazine, right? So these are now quoted in, you can't debate how honored in the community these publications are. I think it was a Scientific American.
March 11, I believe it was published.
Yeah, it had her quote in there. The first thing that came to her mind, I hope it didn't come from our lab.
And then, of course, the Communist Party finds out that she said this.
Well, after they pulled it,
the narrative changes immediately.
After the good doctor had her fingernails pulled out, right? It's like Dr. Lee, the hero of Wuhan, who had his family intimidated. He was tortured and had to sign the rumor mongering. So this is for let's go around the world. Other updates from the U.S. and then we got to get into this the situation in Japan with Abe.
Yeah, I'll just take you through a few of the headlines that jumped out at me this morning from around the world. Romania is extending its quarantine or lockdown rather by another month. The Austrians are beginning to relax the lockdown with shops, parks, and gardening centres now opening in the country. But the stipulation is you've got to wear a mask if you're going to any of these public places. And there is a €25, about $32 fine if you are found to be breaching these rules. The French President Emmanuel Macron gave an address last night that I alluded to yesterday morning.
He addressed the nation last night.
He addressed the nation, and his announcement was that the country will begin easing on May the 11th. So they're looking at another nearly month of lockdown in France. Quote from Macron last night, "The epidemic is not under control." And then further information coming out about a major cultural event in France, obviously being delayed, the Tour de France, not going to be starting in July as was originally.
Have they canceled for the year, or just they're pushing it back?
Postponed, they say. We're not sure yet, I believe, on a specific date that the Tour de France will be reopened. And if it does, we can bet that there aren't going to be the throngs of crowds sitting by the side of the road as they often do. I'm getting the cough from Jack, so I know I have to hand over the microphone in a second.
It's all subtext, baby. It's all subtext.
The Russians, President Putin saying that the country is now facing a, quote, extraordinary crisis as the virus ramps up in Russia now, one of the last countries in the world to really see
this is Jack Maxey's hit parade. We got Russia, we got Sweden, and we got Japan. We got you. Not working out too well for you, Jack. As soon as the Swedes flip, then I've got the trifecta, right?
Well, I got some good news for Jack, is that the Danish are expecting to relax their rules faster than expected. Still waiting for details out of that, but those are the headlines coming out.
Let's go, Jack. I want you to jump in.
I just want to do two more things really quick.
But before we get to the other ones, I want to go back to France. This is important. They essentially look like they're going to be doing their opening around the same time we are.
Yes.
I assume that Newsom today, the other governors in the Northeast Consortium, and the president are going to be looking at not a May 1st, but probably sometime. So, hey, it's still 30 days to save America. We say lock it down, stop all the – if you're going to take another 30, do a hard 30 to try to rein this out. But I believe you'll see the administration probably not on May 1st, but probably bump it back. So that means France and the United States around sometime the same time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you'll see a lot of other countries falling into that timeline as well. The United Kingdom probably a week or two behind that. Belgium, which I mentioned yesterday, has quickly turned into the worst situation in Europe on a per capita basis. The deaths per 1 million at 359 at the moment.
6 times the United States.
Which is 6 times the United States, really jostling with Spain at the moment for the title of top affected country in Europe. And the Spanish have had another slight increase in the death numbers coming out over the last 48 hours. Remember, they had seen a slowing. We were hoping that they were on the downward trend, but actually they've gone slightly back up again. And I suspect we'll see that all across the world when people start, when the tail starts to come about, we'll see some false starts in that, and we'll see some returns to higher death rate numbers as the easing.
How does Belgium, as the head of the where the EU is, have such a bad track record? And Jack, tomorrow we ought to go through the numbers of the EU compared to the United States, because if you look at the EU to the United States, the EU is a disaster, right? I mean, a total, complete disaster. In Belgium, why is Belgium so bad, given that they're supposed to be the control freaks that control the whole continent?
So there's definitely a sort of demographic issue in Belgium about how closely people are living together in cities like Brussels. So there's obviously
Brussels doesn't seem that dense. No high rises in Brussels.
It's quite dense in the places that I've covered there before, like the Molenbeek areas are very densely populated. And if
I'm the populace that only goes to the 5-star places.
Well, that's right. There are no 5-star. Have you been to a 5-star hotel in Brussels? It's not quite a five. These are not.
It's not a 5-star city.
No. There's also there's that element of it which I wonder, and I'm just speculating at this point, whether that plays into it at all. The other thing is the European Commission, the European Union really have lost control over this. They're urging this morning, as one of the lead stories in the Financial Times, Brussels calls for coordinated response to lockdown exit strategies. This is kind of the first time that Brussels has even come into this whole coronavirus situation. They left the Spanish, they left the Italians. I realize the United Kingdom has quote unquote left the European Union, or rather will at the end of the year. No assistance there, no assistance to the Scandinavian countries, no assistance anywhere across Europe, apart from maybe, hey, we're going to help the Germans out, we're going to help Angela Merkel cling on to power throughout all of this. And now they're coming out and saying, well, actually, we're going to help you coordinate the easing of the lockdown. It's not going to fly with a lot of these European member state countries. And Brussels and Belgium, in the wider sense, the European Commission in the capital of Europe, really, really have let the continent down.
And what's the buried lead on the higher mortality rates in Europe?
Tell me.
The failure of socialism and a socialist medical system that failed their people in a time of crisis.
Has that been a crisis? Is this crisis of confidence? Do they have a crisis of confidence now? We've got 20 seconds. Crisis of confidence in the UK because of the problems they've had handling this and the veracity they've had?
No, the Conservative Party is polling higher than it ever has before. Boris Johnson getting a lot of people sympathy because he's had the virus, and also the National Health Service being widely lauded and celebrated. And I hope we can get back into this at another point, because I have some bones to pick about that issue in particular. The National Health Service, in my estimation, has turned into a cult in the United Kingdom.
Okay, we'll return to that and to Jack's analysis of how socialism has failed in the EU. Short break. We'll be back on War Room Pandemic in just a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to the War Room throughout the world, and also into your home, living room, or your apparatus you listen on. It is the 14th of April, the year of our Lord 2020. We're here live on Capitol Hill in the United States of the Federal Reserve. We'll be getting much more into the economic crisis and the financial crisis in the next couple of days. We want to deal with now the CCP and what's happening on the pandemic side and the unlocking of the country, the opening up of the country by the president. I want to go back to the very first show back in January. We had on Bill Gertz to talk about how this thing came about. And the reason we had Bill Gertz on, we knew at the time, giving our sourcing insight of not just the apparatus of the healthcare professionals that we know, that we hired consultants, and these people were very dialed in, and we spent a lot of time before we launched the show talking to people about what's going on. Also our sourcing in China, that we knew something was up big. This is the reason we got on the story early on. People like Bill Gertz and Senator Cotton were mocked and ridiculed. And hey, we're putting that on the back of it. It's not about them being mocked and ridiculed. But here's the point, is that it is incumbent upon the Chinese Communist Party, and this was one of the most important parts of Josh Rogan's interview, in that the clampdown of the scientists. Remember, we have not been given the samples of the actual technical sequencing, I don't believe, definitely not the samples to date. You're in your home, you're broke, you're waiting for a $1,200 check, or you're filing for unemployment, or you're running around, trying to get online and trying to get a form filled out for the payroll protection plan to save your small business. Or if you're Boeing, the board of directors, Nikki Haley resigns because she doesn't want to be part of this kind of, whether it's a bailout or recapitalization, the airline industry, people are arguing about, are they going to be nationalized or not? We're hearing now from guys on Wall Street there's going to be hundreds of bankruptcies because of the poison pills put in by the Democrats. And I'm not saying they're good or bad. I'm saying they put certain things in they had that they required to go in on management control and participation by labor and other things that are poison pills. You may have bankruptcies. All of that came out of Wuhan. Right. And what we know is that the Chinese Communist Party and the senior officials and the medical professionals there knew very early on in December, maybe even to November, we don't know that yet, but we know for a fact in December there was human-to-human transmission, which means you're going to have an epidemic and then a pandemic. And that professionals in places like the Free Republic of China, Taiwan, right, our ally, who've handled this the best of anybody in the world, I think, actually notified the World Health Organization and notified clearly other people associated with the U.S. government that there was human-to-human transmission here. And that's just an incontrovertible fact. We now know that, and they knew it at the time. And so that's why all the piling on of the Bill Gertzes and all these other people, all we're saying at Cotton, all we've been saying from day one is that let's have a full accounting. It's incumbent upon the Chinese Communist Party to have full transparency and full honesty. This is what Josh Rogan said, full transparency and full honesty, because this is a world crisis, and the nations of the world have to come together on this. We got more of this to get to, but real quickly, Jack, you got to talk to me about Abe, and you got to talk to me about Abe's not a guy to light his hair on fire. I've never seen him push something like this, that he's pushing this drug.
Well, there's a drug called Avigan. It's made by Fujifilms. It's been around for a long time. It's an antiviral. They've used it in Japan in the same way that we've used Tamiflu as a influenza drug. Now, Tamiflu, I think we've largely discovered that it doesn't work. Avigan, which had been sitting on the shelf for well over 20 years in Japan, they pulled it out and they've started using it on patients there. Now, there's been some success, and again, as Fauci would say, it's somewhat anecdotal, but you are seeing some other countries in Southeast Asia that are seeking this drug from Japan, Malaysia and Indonesia being two of them that are prominent. We also have a study going on right now for Avigan here in the United States. I believe there's one in New York and there's one up in Massachusetts where they're doing controlled studies to see if it'll work along the same lines of the studies that we're doing with hydroxychloroquine. But again, this is really just one of those situations where medicine is all hands on deck. And I think actually one of the things it's going to show, Steve, and I've said this many times, is the failure of Chinese science. If it turns out that things like Avigan and hydroxychloroquine and some of these other therapeutics work, it will show you that their lack of openness has actually harmed them.
Why is that?
Well, because they're not sharing their studies. For example, Chairman Xi passed a law on the 14th of February that makes it that anything that they publish has to be run through the CCP first. And so if you don't even know what's going on in the province next door, how do you know what the doctors are doing up in Wuhan versus Shanghai in terms of treatment? And this is one of the problems with a totalitarian system. If you don't share information, guess what? It's hard to take that information and move forward with human progress.
How much is so when we talk about this concept of the unlocking will be mass on point, and that will be mass testing, mass therapeutics, mass antibody testing, mass contact tracing, all of that. When we talk about mass on point, how important are all these therapeutics, and particularly the Japanese? How important do you think a role this is going to take?
I think all of this is tremendously important. I think one of the things that we're seeing even in the Western healthcare systems that have really gone to the lockdown is this idea that eventually we're going to have to hit herd immunity or we're going to get a vaccine. But most people seem to think that's at least 18 months out. In fact, on a comparative basis between Sweden and Norway, Norway went to a total lockdown. Sweden has not. Sweden's had a little bit higher mortality rate, but the Norwegian health minister just came out yesterday and said, yeah, we're still going to end up with like 40 to 60% infected no matter what we do.
Which was Dr. Gabriel Lung's thing at the time. It would be 60, 80. Okay. Anything, Raheem, we're going to jump here. Governor Newsom's going to give a press conference statewide at 3 o'clock. That's a big event today. You got the press, you got the announcement of the council later with the president in the Rose Garden or at the White House somewhere. Also, they're going to tease out, I'm sure, the plan of the Eastern governors. So this is now going to get to be the, how quickly the president comes up with a plan.
And of course, a lot of us will be watching what happens to Chris Cuomo as the day goes on after his rant yesterday about how much he didn't enjoy his job.
What was that all about?
Yeah, I don't know. We don't have time to play it right now, but we maybe play it tomorrow morning.
We'll have to play that tomorrow morning. Chris Cuomo, who's I thought did a pretty good job. The only problem I had with the thing was the bromance scene his brother had, which I agree brotherly love, but the brother actually the CBS News cut away from Cuomo's press conference for the first time yesterday, which should be a tell to him that, hey, it may have gone on too long. You might want to tighten it up when the broadcast guys who have followed every word of yours. Okay, hashtag War Room Pandemic. Want to make sure we get all your observations. Also, you got to push out, go to the site, read, and we're going to have further analysis during the day, the Josh Rogan piece. We're going to have Bill Gertz and others. We're going to actually have Stephen Mosher on tomorrow. Stephen Mosher, another a great analyst who's written a great book, Bully of Asia, about CCP, but really gets into this whole Wuhan lab. We'll have Steve Mosher on the show tomorrow. Stephen K. Bannon, make sure you go to hashtag War Room Pandemic.